on this computer. Hello there, Marlena. Welcome to the stream today. Share to a page. All right, and we're going live in 3, 2, 1. Wait, no, not 1 just yet. And now we're live. Okay. All right, everybody. Welcome today to Campus Climate Core Day 8 of what's happening out in COP. Thank you all for joining us today. We have some good content, some more interesting content, and some even better content. So stay tuned today while we dive into exactly what's been going on at COP. Some of the more famous speeches. You may have heard Obama speaking today. We got a little bit on that, and a little bit of an extra tidbit on a presentation that we also did to a Lebanese school. So without further ado, hopefully everyone can see and hear me okay. We're going to go ahead and get started. So just explain a little bit about behind the scenes here. Brumana High School, located in Lebanon, asked us to do a little bit of a presentation on what's happening at COP to some they were 6th graders who really enjoyed our presentation, and hopefully you'll see why in a minute, but this was kind of like a new and introductory thing for them. Lebanon being one of the countries in the Middle East that back in the 1980s advanced quite a bit in technology above many of the other Middle Eastern countries, but fell unfortunately through civil wars, bad economic crises, and so on and so forth. You may have even heard them in the news today, having suffered from massive blackouts due to their economic crisis. However, some of these students took a really particular interest in climate change, even amidst their many problems and issues. So it's really cool to see some of their reactions and questions that they threw at us during today's briefing, which we're going to show like a maybe 5-minute segment on that today.
Mr. Robert Jody Jr. is going to have a little presentation to show you what's been happening concerning the climate change around the world. We don't have a lot of time, so please think about this presentation carefully before you ask any questions at the end, because the questions are going to be very limited. Okay? We have limited amount of time for a question. So this is Rob Jr. Rob, would you like to take it from here, please?
Sure, thank you, Auntie. And hello, students. I'm saying hello from a place called Glasgow, which is in Scotland, where all of the world's leaders have come together to talk about something called climate change. Now, I can see all of you kids, so I want you to be truthful and honest when I ask this question. How many have heard of climate change? Raise your hand. Okay, great. That's fantastic. I'm really happy to hear that. So I'm going to give a little bit of a demonstration on what climate change is, why it's so important, and then we're going to go into a little bit about maybe what's.
So this is probably the first time that I'd ever spoken to 6th graders. So cut me a little bit of slack here, and the more interesting content that we have here in carbon and such. But I felt was really interesting to explain how heat and energy from the sun and even energy that we generate here on the planet work together, and try to explain that to these younger audiences, and a little bit about COP2.
Make sure that we promise that by 2050 this will happen. But they are lying because they're not doing their job. They're not actually showing progress. They're not showing that they're being able to lower that heat as much as they promised in Paris, which is why it's so important that young people come together and they protest these big events. As you can see here, everybody is gathered together. They have signs. They're saying, we are tired of people not keeping their promises, and we want these world leaders to do something, and we want them to do something right now. So that's really why it's very important for young people to protest. But getting back here at the COP, I have attended a lot of these conferences since 2015 in Paris. And I've seen a lot of these things, and I've seen a lot of world leaders come together and make big promises that they do not keep. And that is a big problem, which goes back to why we need to do as much as we can to protest. But it's really important for you students too to learn in school. Why? Because in your future, you are going to need to go into careers, into business, into education, into whatever that you want to become one day, a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, whatever career path you want to be into, it will have some effect on the climate. So if you're an engineer and you want to develop good technology to fight climate change, it's important that you study now so that you get the basic materials, your mathematics, your history, your science, your geography. As long as you're studying this right now, you can have a part to play in making the world a better place. You can actually help to emit less carbon, less heat, and by whatever career path and whatever future you see yourself doing one day. So it's really important to listen to your teachers now so you can have a good impact too one day. Because if the world leaders are not keeping their promises, it's going to be up to us, the individual people, to develop the technology and to develop our career paths so that we can all work together to make our planet a better place. And one thing that I really like to stress here is that it really is up to young people, it's up to you to put pressure on world leaders to ask them to make sure countries are emitting less energy, less carbon, so that we can have a future. And I really like this sign here on the right. Study hard. So listen to your teachers right now, study hard, but protest harder. Make sure that you're writing to your legislators, writing to your leaders and asking them, protesting to them that we really should do something about climate change, or you should do something. You are the world leaders, you are in charge. Help us have a better planet tomorrow.
Is this all happening because we're bringing on the lights and using fossil?
So that's a really good question. So not as much as you might think.
So I think that the kid asked the question on is just turning on light bulbs and running cars really push or really create that much energy. And keep in mind that Lebanon has almost 1% of its entire economy running on renewable energy right now, barely able to sustain its own energy. Actually, it buys quite a bit of it from countries surrounding Lebanon. So I thought that was a really interesting question from some of these students here.
The biggest polluters or the biggest people who cause heat around the world are your oil, are your gas, are your coal power plants, okay? Which means that every single time that a coal power plant, which in coal is a form of energy. So
we'll skip a little bit to, I think, the next question that the student asked.
Non-renewable energy technology. Sure.
So basically, how are we supposed to lower the usage of cars and lights if it's kind of an everyday thing that everybody uses? How are we supposed to decrease that and so we make the planet not absorb too much sun and anything like that?
Very, very good question. Thank you for that question. The most important thing that we can do is to ask world leaders to invest more into clean cars. So have you ever heard of an electric car like a Tesla or like a Nissan Leaf or something like that, right? There is such a thing as electric cars. And the energy from electric cars does not use gasoline. It only uses energy from the sun or uses energy from wind or from water, something that does not create more heat, right? So asking world leaders to provide more access so that we can get clean electric cars or to use clean energy from when we turn on a light bulb, right? It's so important that we ask world leaders to give us access to this, to stop using energy from coal and from bad energy sources that create more heat. We ask that we do not use any more of this, and instead we use more energy from clean power sources. That will help us stop climate change. But it requires you to, like I said before, to listen and to learn now, to study hard, but to protest harder, to ask your world leaders, to ask your leaders to do something about climate change, because they are your leaders and it's their job to help you make sure that you have a planet and a home in your future world.
So there were a couple of dynamics at play with Lebanon. First and foremost being access to renewable energy is non-existent there. And that's mostly due to the political crisis and situation going on through Lebanon right now. But I feel like these kids were asking some really, really interesting questions and pushing them to push or to talk to their local leaders, talk to their government leaders might be a step in the right direction, because access to renewable energy in a place like Lebanon is almost non-existent, like I said. But anyway, I felt that was an interesting tidbit. Really cool to speak to some of those students in Lebanon, especially in an area of the world where access to renewable, like I said, is almost non-existent. But anyway, let's get into the COP briefing officially today. And we'll start off with basically a huge criticism of the COP parties. Keep in mind that we're going into week 2 right now, which is more of the time where negotiations happen. Excuse me, where delegates come together and we start to negotiate over, excuse me, who's getting what. And the legitimacy of the COP26 climate summit was called into question by quite a few NGOs. They basically said that access to the negotiation rooms where all the main leaders are making decisions was extraordinarily restricted as compared to previous years. So what's going on behind those closed doors, no one knows about, or at least the NGOs don't know about it. Only those negotiators themselves, the representatives from each country, excuse me, are actually aware of what's going on behind the scenes. So many NGOs came together and said, we feel like COP26 is going to be a failure because there's no accountability happening right now. And then let's combine that with fact number 2 at the top right, where the fossil fuel industry has the largest delegation at COP26 this week. Over 500 attendees, which is more than any other NGO group, are either direct representatives or have some affiliation with these fossil fuel companies attending COP26, which I suppose there's a couple of dynamics at play here, but one that obviously is something to be worried about is, of course, the lobbying aspect. Not only are these negotiation rooms closed off from the public, closed off from the delegations, closed off from NGOs, but many of the representatives attending these closed off meetings are folks from the fossil fuel industry. So put 2 and 2 together, folks. What's really happening behind the scenes? We don't know, but I think we can take a gander. We can take a little bit of a guess of what's really going on. One interesting quote that I felt we should include was one by the Bolivian chief negotiator, who said there is a systematic attempt by developed countries to remove all discussion about compensation and direct climate finance from these negotiations. Diego Pacheco, I believe, Pacheco, mentioned this quote, or said this quote. I feel like it's a really, really important quote here because, again, many of these first world nations owe what many are calling a carbon debt. For example, the USA has been emitting carbon for many, many more years and in such intensity as compared to some Latin American countries, many African countries who have not yet industrialized or are in the slow process of industrialization. And many claim that the US owes a carbon debt. And that discussion of a carbon debt, well, the compensation, at least with regard to a carbon debt, is not really had, that discussion is not being had at COP26, as the Bolivian chief negotiator said, which I feel is a pretty important point. Also, there was a major protest by scientists themselves, folks with PhDs in the field. In fact, they were actually banned from attending the event on Sunday, not this Sunday, but the past Sunday, for actually blocking the bridge to the COP26 event. But they were out in full force today, reminding folks that even the PhDs are actually out there protesting. Even they are taking a stance for what they see as the folks in the negotiating rooms not listening to the scientists enough, not taking their concerns seriously, barely even reaching definitely going over 1.5, 2.0, possibly even 2.5 degrees Celsius with the current NDCs. And then, of course, one of the major headlines today, Barack Obama. Barack Obama touted his record and expressed his admiration for many American businesses who kept to, kept to the Paris Climate Accord, even under the Trump administration. So even though Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, many American businesses still held to what Obama was asking them to do, the American commitments that Obama was asking them to do while they were under the Paris Climate Agreement. Although it has been said by many that the Paris Climate Agreement was the bare minimum or even below what humanity needed to do. So it may not be a big stretch to say that it wasn't that much of an accomplishment. Obama mentioned that politics is part of the process that will deliver all of us, and made a pretty big deal about young people needing to vote in future elections, saying that it's not up to the folks who are currently in office, saying it's better up to the folks who are coming after them, the folks that we can enable to make good legislation, which means that we have to vote them into office in order to make that good legislation. He also mentioned that cynicism is a recourse for cowards and we can't afford hopelessness. Towards the end of his speech, he mentioned how young people were getting involved, and that gave him some hope. And Obama was all about hope during his election, so kind of a good throwback to his campaign symbols back in the day. When referring to Trump, obviously, he said, I wasn't too happy about that. I think we all weren't too happy about that. But Greta came back a couple hours later. You can shove your climate crisis up your arse, is what she said. And blah, 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 talking about Obama's speech about how the Paris Climate Accord and his participation in signing the Paris Climate Accord was such a big accomplishment, how those American businesses were still holding true to the Paris Climate Agreement. She simply had to say, what I think of Obama is blah, 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 and he can shove his climate crisis up his arse. Really, I think that pretty much says it all from her perspective. And I think she's right. Obama and the Paris Climate Accord are the bare minimum, even below the bare minimum. That doesn't reach 1.5. It doesn't reach 2.0. We need those stronger NDCs, and we need those kept promises now. And she's telling it like it is. You can shove your climate crisis up your arse. Anyway, I'm going to turn this over now to Dr. John Capice, who has some information on economics of COP26 and some of the nations attending COP26. So John, I turn it over to you, and just FYI, you're muted right now.
How's this? Can you hear me?
Can hear you fine.
All right. Well, that's interesting, bold statements by Greta in response to Obama's speech. You made a comment during the presentation to the Lebanese students that the politicians weren't doing their job, that they weren't leading properly. I suppose politicians look at their job as being something different than that, as their job, as far as they're concerned, is to stay in office, to stay in charge, to maintain their positions. And in our democratic systems, that means cobbling together an electoral majority that allows them to remain there. And unfortunately, it seems that our population isn't really all that interested in confronting this issue. So whereas we might like to blame the politicians, it seems a little more deeply rooted than that. It's a characteristic of our populations, what choices they make and what sacrifices they're prepared to make at the present time. Now, of course, our leaders have a responsibility to actually lead, not follow, but that's their preferred approach to electoral politics. So given that Greta has challenged Obama and in effect all of the global leaders on this, I thought I'd try to see what the quantitative basis of her discontent with the state of affairs, what the foundation of that might be. Is there a basis for saying that there just isn't enough going on, even with the new methane agreement, the forestry agreement, and so on that's coming out of this conference? So I thought I'd share a few slides with various numbers. Let's see what I can do here. I just assembled these today. So climate investments, what is it made of? How do we figure out what's actually being spent on it within our country and other countries as well? So climate change investments made up of a number of categories. And I think perhaps the most important category is issue, education, and mobilization, because we've always had the technological ability to deal with this climate change crisis. It might have been more expensive at the time, using older technologies, but had we begun the process, 4 decades ago when we were first aware of the problem, and those of us in the science community were very confident in those forecasts of what was headed our way. If we had begun then with the existing technologies, we could have dealt with it, using different tools perhaps, but we still could have made an awful lot of progress. So issue education and mobilization is probably the most important investment that we've failed to make. Then, of course, you have the technological research and development into all of the various alternative forms of energy, and then the infrastructure within our societies that uses that energy. And then the deployment of these technologies, the deployment of the newly developed solar, wind, and other infrastructure. In addition to that, since we've waited so long, we're now at a point where if we are going to make significant progress in averting abrupt climate change, we're going to have to move toward greenhouse gas removal technology and extracting it from the air and oceans. Often that involves either industrial processes or nature-based processes, such as agricultural approaches that move more carbon back into the soil, whereas historically, through traditional agricultural approaches, we've extracted carbon from the soil and released it into the atmosphere. Now, there are other costs, other investments that are non-preventative. In other words, if we're going to have to spend money on these as climate change becomes a greater fact in our lives with more pronounced impacts on our society, we're going to have to enhance the resiliency of all of our systems. We're going to have to retrofit our existing infrastructure and communities. Then as these disasters strike, we're going to have to go through reconstruction of our communities, of our infrastructure, and also relocate people. And then we also have a responsibility to assist the developing nations with their costs of this full suite of investments, not just dealing with the impacts of climate change, but also making sure that they too can develop their economies using these new methodologies. Now, when you look at assessments of economies of nations, it's usually presented as GDP. And GDP is made up of four primary categories: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. And climate investments can reside in any one of these categories. In consumption, you may not think of it as potentially harboring climate investments, but it includes tuition that individuals pay for their education. And that's really the foundation of most action in our economy and in our culture. So education well spent, and I'm not talking about training necessarily, but education in general for everyone. And then we have the traditional investment categories of research and development into all of the technologies that we're going to need to develop for confronting climate change. But this category includes many things that are unrelated, of course, to climate change. And then the government research and development will be in their category. And then even the net exports can include climate-related costs, the infrastructure that other nations would be using to take on these same challenges. But then often you hear the detractors from climate action as simply saying, well, science will take care of that eventually. We don't really have to worry too much about it. But of course, we all know that scientific progress doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It doesn't just automatically come about. It has to be supported aggressively with huge investments. That's how we've made just about every one of our advances in over the decades. Now, if we look at the US economy during what might be considered the only comparable challenge that we faced as a nation, World War II, we see that our economy started out in 1939 at a certain level, and then as the war ramped up, the economy grew significantly, but so did the investments, the expenditures directly related to that war. And it reached almost 40%. It hovered in the 33 to to 37% by some estimates. But you can also see that a lot of that cost of the war was in fact accounted for in the growth of GDP. So yes, the war cost huge amounts of money and lives, obviously, but a lot of the money came from the growth in the economy. But it was a very large undertaking, a third of our economy or more. Now, our current economy in the United States is on the order of $20 trillion. And if you're looking at a third of that or 35% of that, you're looking at $7 trillion a year. Now, compare that to the Biden infrastructure bill recently passed, which they say is $1 trillion over 8 years. So that's $0.13 trillion per year. Now, compare that to the $7 trillion that an actual war, a serious, life-threatening, existential threat war would cost this nation. And you can see that even if everything in the Biden infrastructure bill was focused on climate change, it would still only be 2% of what we spent in our most recent existential challenge. So Greta is right. You know, whereas Obama might think we're making progress, yes, we're doing more. He did more than Trump did. Biden is doing more than Trump did, but it's still orders of magnitude below what it needs to be. These things need to be more than 10 times the current or even the proposed expenditure levels. So where Greta challenges these leaders is on really recognizing the scale of the threat and what it requires from each nation, particularly the nations like the United States, like Western Europe, like China, that have the largest economies and the greatest capacity for helping the world through this challenge. Now, I went on to look at the research and development expenditures by nation, and I ranked all of the countries for which there were data by their percent GDP allocated to research and development. Now, of course, research and development in any nation is going to largely be for consumer products. But as I pointed out in a previous slide, climate expenditures can hide in many other categories of GDP. So we could perhaps use R&D as a generalized surrogate for a nation's investment in climate change. And you can see that R&D at best in the world by countries like Israel and South Korea doesn't even exceed 5% of GDP. Globally, it's about 2%. The United States is typical in that at about 2.8%, and so on. So if you take the top 20 nations, like the G20, as they call it, by GDP, and you combine their respective investments in R&D, you come up with over 90% of global research and development expenditures. So these 20 nations out of the 200, participating in these UN processes, these 20 or 10% really have the bulk of the responsibility for getting the ball rolling and creating the necessary momentum. Now, of course, every single country on the planet has a role to play, particularly through their human resources. I mean, when you look down this list, you see India down there at number 16 with 1.1% of their GDP invested in R&D. And we in this country know that it's a little more than 1.1% of Indian nationals, of folks coming to this country from India who are engaged in research and development in this nation. So the human resources of every nation are available and in fact predisposed to pursue new directions and new career paths. So they can be a primary driver on the human resource level, whereas the other nations must be the primary driver on the financial level. To try to highlight the fact that technology takes many years to come online and yield true dividends on confronting the climate crisis, I took the case of solar photovoltaics, solar panels, and I looked at the gigawatt capacity, the global capacity of installed solar panels around the world. And since these panels last 30 years or more, we really have not gotten to a point where a significant number of the early installed solar is going offline. So I was able to make some assumptions based upon the typical production of a kilowatt of capacity installed on a rooftop or in a solar array field as to how many kilowatt hours they might generate in a year. And I combined that with some data I found on what's called the energy payback break-even time of solar modules, of solar infrastructure. And then I made some assumptions between where it started, where this technology started, and where it's reached now. And I'll explain that in the coming slides. So this shows you the rapid increase of the installed capacity of solar. So you can see that it was relatively small up until about 2010. And then we started getting significant deployment of solar infrastructure, and to where now we're exceeding 100 gigawatts of installation each year. And it's probably reached 200 very soon, 200 gigawatts per year. But at the same time, the level of technology, the sophistication, the quality of this solar infrastructure has dramatically changed over the years. So just as the installation has ramped up, the efficiency has also ramped up, not in the efficiency of the actual solar modules themselves, which remains on the order of 20%, but relative to the energy payback period. So the original solar panels were rather clunky, heavy, a lot of material went into these, and relative to the amount of energy that came back. So it started out back in the late 90s with an energy payback break-even time of about 10 years. And then through one of the classes, I told you, Rock, about this question: at what point will previous solar installations, in effect, provide the energy for the new solar installations? And Barry Jacobson had said that that was no longer really an issue because the energy payback period was now less than 1 year, on the order of 9 months. Well, we all know that whereas the most advanced technology may have reached that 9-month level of payback, in other words, after you've operated a solar panel for 9 months, it's generated enough energy to account for all of the inputs that go into the production of that infrastructure, not just the panel, but the inverters, the structural supports, etc., as well as accounting for the mining. So there has to be a complete inventory analysis, a complete life cycle assessment of this infrastructure to determine its actual full payback time, represented in energy units. So I took the data, I took the starting point of 10 years and the ending point of 9 months, and sort of projected the various curve types that might represent how the technology progresses. And you can have a simplistic straight line reduction, or a concave or a convex curve. But I think the 2020 and the 2022 shape of the curve is probably a reasonable depiction at this point. Of course, it will take more of a sinusoidal, a logistics curve approach later on, where you'll get diminishing returns on the reductions. But during these relatively early periods of technological development, it probably follows this shape of a curve. But it's also true that once a factory for producing solar modules is constructed, just like a coal plant, just like a natural gas plant, the investors are going to want to fully depreciate that asset and extract as much value from it as they can. So even though the most advanced technologies may offer a 9-month payback period, there is going to be significant capacity within the system producing the products that go on our roofs that create these solar energy fields that represent older technology and longer energy payback periods. So you have to make some assumptions, and I haven't seen many published articles on this, and I'm going to continue to look for more to see if somebody's really teased this out and figured out in any given year what the aggregate energy payback period might be for that year's deployment. But assuming these curves of improvement in technology, you get different points in time at which you finally achieve a net negative greenhouse gas impact. In other words, in the early deployment, you're actually making the problem worse. You're in effect injecting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere by using these solar technologies than what you're saving through the renewable energy sort of approach. And the curves for this look something like this. So if it follows the first curve, we might have started achieving net greenhouse gas reductions in 2013, another curve 2018, third curve 2020, or 2022. And I think the best case scenario is probably that green 2022 curve, which in effect tells us that in 2022, we would finally start having net benefits from our solar deployment. So what this tells us is that any new technology is going to follow relatively similar trajectories on its deployment and its improvement in the actual technologies relative to the costs and benefits. So we have to begin developing technologies and going through the iterative cycle of new basic science approaches, foundations for the equipment, and then also improvements in the production and deployment efficiency. So the sooner we get started on this, on any technology, the sooner it'll yield net benefits. But realizing that in the short term or the medium term, as it might be 20 years, it may in fact contribute to the problem before it effectively begins to address the problem. So again, back to what Rock pointed out in his slide set: study hard, protest harder. In other words, in this case, it might be innovate hard and deploy harder. So we have to develop these technologies and get them used in our economy very effectively. So Rock, back to you.
Innovate hard and deploy harder. I like it. Well, thank you so much for that presentation, John. We do have a question in the chat from Dr. Mulkey. Has anyone at the COP noticed or responded to the lead article in the Washington Post that shows that the accounting system being used is deeply flawed based on inappropriate data about emissions for each country? I saw quite a bit of news related to that article, which is actually a lot worse than I think a lot of people realize, mostly because every estimation that we're making at this point, and especially the NDC negotiations, are all based on flawed accounting systems. And that means that at this very point in time, based on whether I mean, which we might even assume is purposefully not accounted correctly for, it's going to throw all of our projections out of whack for the next few years. So getting those numbers down right is extraordinarily important. But I mean, I'd be also interested in finding and pointing some fingers too to find out who's been jeopardizing the accounting system here. And now we're going to have to pay for that even more. John, do you have some thoughts?
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts on that.
I knew that you'd say that.
Yeah. Yeah, because this has been my thing, since you've known me. And it has in fact been what I've been harping on since I first became introduced to the topic back in the 80s through, H.T. Odom's program at UF and the courses that his graduate student at the time, Mark Brown, was teaching. And I took a graduate course as an undergraduate. It was a little rough on me. It was difficult, but it opened my eyes and it pointed out that as much as we might like to think that us engineers and scientists making these cool discoveries are critical to the process, really it's more about the accountants. The accountants are the ones who, if done properly, that process really keeps us on track, keeps us pointed in the right direction, and keeps us honest about where we're at along a trajectory. So there's a lot of problems with the accounting in that, one, we don't necessarily know how to do it all that well. I took on a project I proposed it in 2008 and finally got to work on it in 2012 to do that sort of accounting on sugarcane biofuels, ethanol from sugarcane, because sugarcane is grown in Florida largely on organic soils that release carbon into the atmosphere as part of the cultivation process. So you're releasing carbon into the atmosphere by draining the soils and cultivating them. Then you're pulling the carbon back out into the plant. And then you're going through this whole rigmarole to produce the alcohol, which you then put in a gas tank of a vehicle and then combust it for energy. And it just seemed logical, once you look at the mass balance of how much carbon is being taken up by the sugarcane and released by the soils, that they could just eliminate the middleman, so to speak, and just scrape an inch of this soil off the fields each year and just shovel it into a furnace directly, and then power the electric vehicles, and you'd have basically the same outcome, but with greater efficiency, because you've eliminated all of the intermediate steps. So there are cases where people don't even honestly understand what's going on in the process. And then there's cases where people intentionally deceive one another for competitive advantage. And any sort of governmental program that you create to incentivize people to do the right thing, they're going to abuse it extraordinarily. And we've seen that with the water program. Back in the 90s, we developed a dispersed water storage program to address some of the water quality issues. And then we found that as soon as it was enacted, the companies lobbied the government such that the program that they enacted did not include all of the caveats and conditions that we designed into the original proposal. And it came out of Frankenstein's monster of original intent, which the companies simply used to exploit and extract more money from the government without delivering the intended productivity. So did you want to chime in here, Steve?
Yeah, I wanted to say that the Washington Post article really focused on accounting from natural and semi-natural systems, from land use and from the land-based emissions tallies and uptake values. And it showed how the same thing that was true of offsets, that it's a shell game, and that whenever biological offsets are included or biological net zeros are used, what you end up with is an elastic system where if you stop the emissions in one spot, they increase in another. So it's essentially a whack-a-mole game, and it has to be comprehensive globally. So for biological issues that are at the heart of the flawed accounting system that the Washington Post article pointed out, you have to have the same accounting rules worldwide. And that is absolutely not the case. They vary from country to country. The data that are being used are from different years. China, for example, doesn't have really accurate numbers from 2019. And if you extrapolate from 2015, the emissions from China are far higher than they say they are. Similarly, Malaysia, which has a huge palm oil issue, has much higher emissions from land use than it's claiming. In fact, its neighbor has less emissions than its neighbor by a factor of 2, or more. I can't remember what the numbers were, but its neighbor has the same basic economy on the land, and Malaysia just has declared that it doesn't have a problem. And so compared to the other neighboring countries. So many countries don't have any updates since 2015 or even earlier. And so it really becomes a challenge to extrapolate from their last greenhouse gas inventory to get to anything that approximates a realistic outcome for how to do the accounting for the COP26. Perhaps most alarming to me is that the COP26 negotiators and the countries themselves all seem to be okay with this. That they're, for example, if you look at the integrated assessment models, they're absolutely terrible at accounting for landscape level emissions and uptakes. If you take a sectorial analysis where you look at different parts of agriculture, different parts of forestry, and you do a bottom-up analysis, you get a very different result than the integrated assessment models give you. And so a lot of what's being talked about at COP26 is based on the IAMs. And those certainly aren't reflecting what's actually happening on the ground. That if, as an ecologist and somebody who's been doing this for 30 years on climate change, the one thing that troubles me the most is the lack of accurate inclusion of ecosystems and natural and semi-natural systems in the overall climate modeling, the CMIP-6, the CMIP-5, and the IAMs. It's really disgraceful that the scientific community would be using some of these numbers that are essentially plucked out of thin air. The climate modelers themselves are so enamored of their modeling that they don't understand what actually happens in the ecosystems that they're claiming to include in the models. So I'll shut up. But it's deeply troubling to me.
I think a lot of the modelers appreciate that. You know, I remember taking these courses in the early to mid 1980s from Jim Jones, who was developing, you know, all of these crop models. And he would tell us, and we would see as we investigated these models, the gross simplifications that they embodied.
Yeah.
But, you know, to their credit, they were always working on enhancing them and improving them over time. But then when I finally finished my PhD and went down to a faculty position in Immokalee to focus on water and water quality, I always had the climate perspective in mind, realizing that in no way could we make meaningful progress on water quality issues over the required time period unless we also dealt with climate change, because it was obvious back then in the early 90s that it would take 30, 40, 50 years to make any improvements in the water quality at the pace people were moving. And as you might be making progress on the water quality front, the climate stressors would be simultaneously increasing, yielding no net benefit in the total outcome. So it was clear back then that we needed a suite of what we would call unit models, you know, different landscapes from the ecosystem as well as the production system that we would superimpose upon these ecosystems, whether it was a vegetable, cattle, you know, standard row crops, or what have you, citrus. And there was just no effort to pursue that, much less to really drill down into the native ecosystem to see what's going on there. And then once we moved into the water quality front on the BMPs and the TMDLs, the federal program to reduce nutrients, you could immediately see all of the agency people starting to play spreadsheet games where they would plug in numbers. They create spreadsheets of the supposed sources of all these nutrients and problems. And then they would just sort of apply, quote, BMPs and make assumptions at their reductions. So then their spreadsheets begin to show improvements, reductions in the release of nitrogen and phosphorus. Meanwhile, the actual data from the watersheds showed steady increases. So these spreadsheet games that they're playing, either with water, nutrients, or carbon, are all largely the same, practiced by the same type of people through both ignorance and intent.
I'm going to have to go, but I enjoyed hearing this. Rock, thanks for being there. It must be really late where you are. So I really appreciate your reporting. I wasn't able to attend except one time last week because I had to give my own talks to various places. But anyway, take care, guys. I'll see you later.
You bet,
Bye-bye.
Dr. Mulkey, and thank you for the talks you're giving too. Happy to be here on our end, but you always do a fantastic job. So hopefully all those students are consuming that knowledge too.
I'm rocking some boats.
All
right, bye-bye.
All right, take care now. Well, I'm gonna check the Facebook live feed. We don't looks like we have no questions on that front. So
Lacey, you don't have a question? You got to have a question or a comment. Maybe she's off working, doing some actual work while listening to this.
No, I think it's just really interesting that you bring up the accounting system being used at COP, because I mean, you would think this COP would be one of the most important ones, considering we're a year into the decade that, you know, this is like the time zero for everything. And so the fact that there's still this flawed accounting system and that's what we're relying on to create these negotiations is, it's a little bit scary.
Yeah, and it is a combination of both ignorance and intent, because one of the briefings that I attended online before coming here, done by a Washington entity that was created by Congress years ago to try to address some of these climate change issues and keep them informed. Basically, the person delivering the briefing said that a big concern for COP26 was intentional double counting on the part of some nations. They were actually trying to rig the accounting system so they could double count credits.
Yeah, that's something I heard about too when I took a managing for climate change class, and we talked about, we actually modeled like a COP conference, and we all were like a country, and we had to look into what other countries had done in the past, and it was kind of interesting to see how people were trying to rig the system when you get there, and it was also kind of concerning, especially like thinking of how everyone kind of applauds the Paris Agreement as like such a big accomplishment, when also it's based on a similar flawed accounting system.
And this happens a lot in the environmental field, where well-intentional people will propose something and build in all of the correct mechanisms and checkpoints and, you know, what if and that, and trying to dot all the I's and cross all the T's. And then it gets into the political process and it gets contorted completely. So the original advocates are confronted with a choice. They can either say, hey, this is crazy. This does not resemble what I designed and proposed. Or they can keep their mouth shut and take what marginal improvement the proposal provides, because it's hard to advocate for something and then turn around to the public and say, no, never mind what I said before. It's really bad the way they've implemented my idea. It happens all the time. I went through that with the dispersed water storage program, and I've seen many other situations of that type. So it's a problem. It's a problem, because if you do reverse yourself and then advocate against your original proposal, everybody kind of looks at you like you must have screwed up somewhere along the way because you did not shepherd this thing through properly. Well, that's true, because politics dominates, and us scientists and engineers and bean counters wind up overwhelmed by the political forces and the power politics that goes on.
Yeah, it's kind of like a double-edged sword in a way.
Mhm.
Definitely. Not to mention the fact that many of these politicians consider the Paris Agreement their legacy. So backtracking on that concept, like for example, Obama today, a lot of his presentation referred to his leadership and his ability to put together the nations to sign this agreement. And then you come back to him and you say, okay, well, wait a minute, the accounting has been flawed this whole time. It's going to be extraordinarily hard for somebody like President Obama, or even many world leaders who signed the Paris Agreement in 2015, to come forward and admit, yeah, the accounting was screwed up on this one. So who the can is going to fall down to down the road as we keep kicking it is going to be interesting to see. But actual owning up to the actual numbers is going to happen at some point, or we're all going to die. John, don't say anything. Don't say it.
Yeah. But it is the case. Those numbers point out very clearly, when you're faced with something as serious as this, we ought to be treating it like we treated World War II, with the same level of intensity and investment. And we're not even close. We're more than 10. We'd have to increase things by at least 20 times what we're proposing now, and to really give it a just effort. We're not even close.
Yeah, and I would also say just basing only everything off of GDP, it kind of also negates like the ideas of climate justice too, because you can't really capture a lot of those social benefits that are also coming from these really large investments. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's why I was simply using it as where the money needs to come from. Obviously, the cultural and the human resource assets are distributed equally throughout the world. Exactly
true. All right. Lacey, any other thoughts that you'd like to mention, since Facebook Live, it's not really much on that front. So you have any other last questions you want to throw at us before we close out here today? Feel free to do so.
I think I'm good. I just want to say that I applaud Greta Thunberg for everything she does. I mean, to be able to be that young and then have like the courage to go up on a stage in front of all these world leaders and tell them like that's not like what you're saying is not enough, and it's not like you're not saying anything really.
Blah blah blah.
Yeah.
So true. Yeah. All right, well, in that case, we'll round up today, finish our day 8 briefing. And thank you, Lacey. Thank you to everyone who attended the Zoom, and especially thank you to all of our folks listening here on the Facebook page. Really appreciate you. And as always, if you have questions, just please feel free to mention them in the comments on our future videos. Be happy to answer them live. And of course, if you have any other questions, feel free to send us an email, reach out to us over Facebook and any of our other social media. And we will see you all tomorrow night at the same time for our day 9 briefing. Stay tuned.
Thank you.